I've been told that I will be the guy who will drive you to the party. So, to drive you to the party, I have chosen to talk about ASP.NET Core and to focus in particular on the challenges and the opportunities that it provides. So far, personally, and only speaking for myself, I can hardly say I'm a big fan of whatever is core, the entire .NET or just ASP.NET. The reason is that at this time of my life and career, I'm asked to be extremely pragmatic and just take care of the few things that I know that work. Work for my customers, for my own business. When I was younger, I was enthusiastic about whatever new was coming out from the industry. I was curious. Not that now I'm no longer curious, but my curiosity must be justified by strong business reasons. So if I don't have particular problems to solve, or if I'm not particularly unsatisfied with the current ways of doing things, I believe I have no reasons to look elsewhere. But this, again, this is my personal perspective. So I'm not saying in any way you should do as I do. Far from me this idea. So at the moment, most of the code I write for my company and my customers consists of web front ends that I do for most of it using ASP.NET MVC, generating a large chunk of the markup on the server side, so serving HTML the classic way, and then using JavaScript on the client side only to make the interaction between the page and the user easier. So I'm still doing JavaScript the old way using jQuery. There was a very nice article that went through Facebook, most Facebook public pages, and Twitter last week. What it means, well, in summary, it was what it means to be a JavaScript developer in 2016. And in this beautiful article, it starts like, there's a conversation between, let's say, an old-style web developer like me, say, and my son, okay? Just a very young geek. And it says, look, the old one says, look, I was thinking of adding some JavaScript to our web pages. I just thinking of calling, some JSON endpoint, get some JSON data, and then build up a table dynamically just to populate, to make it more interactive. And I was thinking of using jQuery to call a JSON, to get some JSON. What? We are in 2016. Nobody uses jQuery anymore. You have to use Browserify, Webpack, Transpilers, TypeScript, React, Angular, this or that. But the nice thing is that, it's a long article, but the nice thing is that the young people, the young man tries to explain what it means to do JavaScript today, and says, well, you don't have to use jQuery, you have to use React. Okay, that's fine. So it's another library? Yes, okay. Show me what it means to use React. Well, in first place, you have to install 3 other libraries to enable React to work, to enable React to compile, to enable... In the end, it's a total mess. And the nice thing along the article is that... And then Angular? Yeah, but that was a 2015 thing. We were using jQuery UI in 2014. Well, man, we are in 2016 now. So I'm the old kind of JavaScript person. So for what I do, I, at the moment, feel no need to look elsewhere. The only thing I could complain about a little bit is a a better razor. Now, Core, ASP.NET Core, it offers me a little bit better than today API to essentially do things like authentication, authorization, a better, richer razor syntax. It doesn't change significantly the way in which you deal with controllers and generate views. It changes nothing in the way in which you use interactive things on the client side, JavaScript, CSS, and things like that. It doesn't address in any way, let's say, business-oriented problems we may have for web apps. It does nothing to teach people, to show people how to create better architectures in their code. Okay, you say, architecture is a different thing that you don't expect a framework to do. Yes, but if, good architectural practices were put into, say, Visual Studio templates or presented in documentation, that would be helpful to developers. Again, it's not the work you expect from the authors of a framework, but it's something I personally would expect, I would love to see from a big company like Microsoft. But anyway, trying to be more technical, we talk web development. We cannot ignore that there are a bunch of mobile devices out there. The answer to this problem, which, by the way, I'm very, very sensitive about, is responsive web design. Now, there is no reason for not having a bunch of pages responsive. No reason. Whether you achieve those by a template you buy from a web agency or download from one of the million websites out there, or you create that yourself using Bootstrap or manually media queries. But the problem is that responsive web design, just because it makes a point of ignoring the device, doesn't tell you anything about the device. So when you do responsive web design and you resize a browser window to 360 pixels of width, from the perspective of the engine you have on the client, there is no difference at all between a desktop browser window resized to 360 pixels and an Android device. Yet, there are quite a few things instead that you would do differently, or your users would love to see done differently on an Android device, 360 pixels wide. Want an example? Input of dates, or input of anything you select from a drop-down list. Because dates or drop-down lists, so that the type of the input tag you use will be treated differently by a mobile browser than it is by most desktop browsers. Chrome treats dates in some way, Opera in another way, Internet Explorer doesn't handle them at all, Edges in another way. So there is a lot of differences. So most of us resolve the input of data by putting custom drop-down components. But drop-down components to select data, if you don't distinguish between mobile and non-mobile devices, brings mobile users to work in a way that they don't like. So in order to change the type attribute of input fields, you need to recognize whether the mobile is really a mobile device or not. And there is nothing, and this is a business problem that will really make developers' life easier and happier. And there is nothing like this being addressed in a new version of ASP.NET. And the list could go on and on. So, when I first heard of ASP.NET Core, for a moment I hoped that what I consider real problems, aspects that can be improved today, have been addressed. Nothing like this. But there are other business-oriented aspects that have been addressed. Except that, again, personally speaking, none of them is of any interest to me personally, and I guess I'm not the only one in this industry. Let's go into more details. Now, this is a screenshot that I took last week and shows the roadmap for ASP.NET Core for sure. So we have now version 1.0 released in June. 1.1, the expected time frame, there is an asterisk over there, and at the end of the page the asterisk says this may change. Let's say Q1, quarter one next year, so let's say March, with an interesting list of new features to be added. Let's take a look. URL rewriting middleware, response caching middleware. Response caching middleware. Beyond the new wording, it means output cache. And apparently, there is no output cache support now in ASP.NET Core. Middleware has MVC filters, and if you have ever used ASP.NET, if you used to work with ASP.NET MVC, probably you want to use filters. And middleware, common middleware, is not yet exposed as MVC filters. Cookie-based temp data provider. Okay, we don't have that one today in MVC. There are implementations of that freely available, but temp data cookie-based solves a specific problem, a development problem, because when you attempt to do a light form of CQRS between two pages, so you post a form and then you redirect back to another page instead of returning the view directly on the post, from the post, which is a good practice. It's called the post redirect get pattern. When you do that, and there is some data that you have to show back, for example, an error message, because of the redirect, that information is lost, because the generation of the error message and the display of the error message are two different requests. So you have to save the info somewhere. Microsoft specifically introduced, since the beginning of MVC, the temp data component, which is a sort of short-lived session, and today is implemented internally using session. And because of that, it doesn't scale. I mean, in a web farm or cloud environment, it doesn't work. Or it doesn't work if you disable deliberately sessions. So cookie-based temp data provider would be an helpful piece of code that is not there yet. And then Azure integration, and then advanced features like view components, pre-compilation of views, or whatever. 1.2 that they schedule for this first half of next year. Web API security, WebSockets, and biggest of everything, SignalR. We don't have SignalR now in ASP.NET Core. Now, what does it mean as I read this? No estimates, long way to Tipperary, work in progress, plans subject to change. It's still a work in progress, essentially. And because it's a work in process, for me, it's not an option now, period. But probably sort of a year from now, at least at the very minimum second half of next year, so when all these things have been done, and probably more, and the same entity framework core would get more stability, things the perspective on this, on the usability of this framework can change. Here I'm really speaking for myself. So this is an absolute personal opinion. As I say things, .NET Core and friends, including ASP.NET Core, is more crucial for Microsoft as a company than for me and, I guess, many other, let's say, the rest of us. But anyway, it's a relevant update that brings some interesting things. Challenges. So if you consider using now ASP.NET Core, you have to face the following challenges. It's MVC only. So if you have skills or investment made in web forms that you cannot simply drop, that's an issue. It's C# only. Well, probably no big deal, but if you have code, significant investment done in code that you don't want to lose in F# or in Visual Basic, that could be an issue. There is some aspects of the API that are totally new. I will give a few examples in a moment. So there are not different things, but different ways of doing known things that you have to figure out and learn. I mean, if you today you can say authenticate, set up a login form even without using identity, Microsoft ASP.NET Identity. You can set up a login form in a matter of seconds. You have to figure out how to do that in Core. And they say use identity. And if I don't want to use identity, if I want to do my stupid forms authentication style kind of thing, forms authentication is no longer supported the way it was. And you have to figure out how it is. And there is nearly no documentation at the moment. But the list of similar things, similar common known things that you have to learn how to do differently, this link is pretty long. But okay, once you have learned how to do the new way of doing certain things, you're done. I mean, you set up, you got started, and you can go ahead. So every developer, even the most senior developer, needs to go through a learning step, a learning path. Maybe short, maybe a few weeks, but everyone, no exception, needs to learn how to use this new framework. New hosting model. Everything is different, totally, completely different as far as the hosting and the deployment of the application is concerned. Yes, there are tooling, there are this, there are that, but nothing is really reliable now. Maybe in 6 months will be a completely different scenario, but now there's the hosting model and nobody knows in detail how it works. So deploying an app, configuring an app for production is a challenge. Who knows how it really goes? Would you take the responsibility? Up to you. No IaaS centrism. Microsoft, in a way, is dismissing IaaS as the primary host for ASP.NET applications. This is a significant turnaround. That leads me to say this kind of thing is much more important for Microsoft than for me or for us, or for developers. So when Microsoft says, IaaS, oh yeah, it's just one of the possible hosts, they make a strong statement. I'm not saying a wrong statement, a strong statement that changes completely their perspective of things. And because we are Microsoft customers, such a strong statement can have an impact on us. And as a CTO, I mean, as a lead architect, I feel I am very concerned. I want to proceed steadily, slowly, to ascertain what is right, what is wrong, what can affect my own business. And then, furthermore, there is a new .NET framework, which could even be the old .NET framework. Because now when you target an ASP.NET app, you have to choose which .NET framework you want to target. It can be the classic old known .NET framework, as it is today, or it can be .NET Core, a subset of the .NET framework rewritten to be cross-platform. And now you see a sort of double road. Because if you choose to go the classic .NET framework, what is the benefit? I would say nothing or sort of. Because you have to anyway retouch and rewrite some parts of your code. Data, probably some parts of data access, authentication probably, configuration, and many others, no signal R, and many other small things all around. For what? Just to say, oh, our new hosting model, probably not the same performance on IIS. For what? Just because you can say, oh, we adopted ASP.NET Core. So, as I see things, the real possible return on the investment of using now .NET Core is if you choose the other, smaller .NET Core framework. That will enable the new hosting model, so a side-by-side deployment model, and at the cost of having to drop libraries you are using now, unless those libraries, external third-party libraries, unless those libraries have not been ported to Core themselves. You may be in the need of rewriting portions of your code that use some APIs in the .NET framework that are no longer supported or have been rewritten for the .NET Core. So every single line of your code is at risk of being rewritten or slightly fixed. There's no guarantee that when you take your own code now to .NET Core, it works. If you are writing from scratch a new application, that could be a different story. You just write, but as you write, you learn to use the new framework. So your speed of development is not, and your productivity is not going to be, for at least I would say a year, the same you have today. Every single developer, even the most senior developer, has to go through a learning path. On the other side, which opportunities do we have? So what can we gain by adopting as soon as possible ASP.NET Core? For sure, we have X cross-platform. So we can write, if we choose .NET Core, we can write our ASP.NET applications and host them on Linux, and we can write and test those apps on Mac and host those apps on Linux and whatever else. That is interesting. If that is, I mean, this is something totally new and something that in a way you get for free. For free once you have created an app facing all those challenges. That's something that you can call, you can put on the green side of your return on investment. If being cross-platform is really a plus, and everybody knows, has an answer, should have an answer, given the context, the business context in which they operate. But if you are going to still host your apps on IIS, still developing using Windows computers and Visual Studio, being cross-platform is not necessarily a great plus. Improved APIs, so there are not really advertised in the current state of the documentation, but there are some improvement in the overall ASP.NET API in ASP.NET Core, which is good. One of the things is that now we have a lot more control over the features, the runtime features we enable. This is an interesting aspect because it gives us the power in a way to control, to some extent, the memory footprint of web applications, ASP.NET Core web applications. And if we are hosting these apps on a cloud platform, keeping the memory footprint low can represent a cost-saving benefit. Another opportunity is if any of those two previous opportunities sound intriguing and attractive, to achieve those things, you don't have to pay a training cost, a training bill that is particularly higher. Because at the end of the day, the paradigm of development is the same. Once you have figured out how to redo those 5 to 10 different things common of web development in a different way, you're pretty much done. So it's correct to say that every single developer needs to go through a learning path. But this learning path is probably pretty steep. So you go, it ends in a short amount of time. So every developer could be up and running using this in a relatively short time, but every developer, even the most senior. At the end of the day, you still deal with controllers, with views, with JavaScript, with CSS, with you are still called to layer your code through common application layer repositories, things like domain-driven design, whatever you do. So the design patterns and architectural patterns are exactly the same. So it's, if you find cross-platform and cross-platform essentially, and control over memory footprint to be real strong business reasons, well, consider that. You decide, that's it. But you decide, not the hype you may hear around Core, .NET Core. It's cool, it's great, it's fantastic. You decide, looking at the numbers that you can figure out of that. What we have now, this represents the architecture. Let's try to get more technical now. This is what we have now. There is the .NET framework, the full .NET framework. ASP.NET interacts with the .NET framework, and ASP.NET is coded using, at the moment, 3 different programming APIs: Web Forms, MVC, and Web API. Now, be aware that today, Web Forms and MVC rely both on the same runtime pipeline, which is based on system.web, the nefarious system.web assembly, which was created the first time in 1996, 98, on the very, very, very first prototype of what became at some point ASP.NET. The fact that MVC and Web Forms rely on the same pipeline is the technical explanation why in the same web application today you can have both ASPX pages and controllers. If you haven't tried that, you could do that. I have many projects in production using this pattern. At the end of the day, everything that we map ends up mapped on controllers in an MVC application has been intercepted at the gate through a common global HTTP handler, written as you would write HTTP handlers in old web forms programming style. So it's the same kind of thing. Okay? And then we have a Web API. Web API doesn't rely on system web, but it has a distinct doubled runtime pipeline. You know what it means? Today, when you decide, victim of the hype, that you have to go, you have to be RESTful, and you have to create a REST interface using Web API. You are simply doubling the memory footprint, because you load system web, and that's unavoidable, plus an extra runtime pipeline, the Web API runtime pipeline. So when they complain, oh, we have to drop system web because the memory footprint is too big, it's partly true and partly false. It's true that system web is not possible to be broken in pieces. It's not granular. It's a black box. That's it. Either you take it or not. Even though some runtime services can be disabled. Check out my books of 10 years ago. Okay, session authentication, those services, those HTTP modules, they can be disabled. Okay? But the fact that this whole thing grew big is that we have two runtimes, especially if you have a Web API. But the culprit is system web, which is old, which is probably deserving a complete rewrite. I agree. But the problem of memory footprint becoming too big is not simply system web, but it's a system web plus Web API. And you know what they're doing in ASP.NET Core? They're doing this. So, by the way, this whole thing is called the integrated pipeline. So all these things run on IIS in a way that is called an integrated pipeline. So IIS and ASP.NET are the same thing. They share the same runtime environment. And Microsoft started pointing at this picture the first day they pushed out ASP.NET back in 2000. For reasons due to the fact that such big teams like the ASP.NET team and the IIS team were hard to synchronize together on regular release cycles, the integrated pipeline, which was an original goal of 2000, was reached only in 2000, I think 6 or 7, when Microsoft released IIS 7. And now they say, no more integrated pipeline. It's a bad thing. IIS is no longer the preferred hoster of ASP.NET applications. And this makes sense because now the future of ASP.NET is to become something completely cross-platform. So there's no reason why IIS, why the internal architecture of web applications should take advantage of internal capabilities and characteristics and architectural characteristics of IIS. Which also means it has to be seen in action if the performance is exactly the same on IIS. It will be probably acceptably good on IIS and Apache, but probably it would not be optimal on either. So, .NET Framework, and we have two possible flavors, the full .NET Framework and the new .NET Core Framework. The ASP.NET environment only using MVC to generate a response. MVC relies on OWin, an OWin module. OWin is Open Windows Interface, so it's essentially a general purpose interface for a hosted application and a web server to communicate. And that is the key that enables the ASP.NET Core app to work and to talk to different flavors of web servers. Today, OWin and integration, they are merged into the internal architecture of IIS. So ASP.NET ends up being fused to IIS. That is what is called integrated pipeline. There is a strict decoupling between the space of the web server, the space of the application, and some intermediate tools, what I've called integration there. And the integration essentially uses the OWIN interface to have the web server to communicate according to a fixed common static contract with the hosted application. There is only MVC there. And in the previous slide, instead, we had web forms, MVC, and web API. So now, what they have done is they dropped entirely system web. They recreated from scratch a runtime pipeline, and they did that inspired by the runtime pipeline of web API. So they took MVC and they essentially put MVC on top of the same runtime of web API. Today, if you check out classes, you see that web API has controller classes, has a way of programming that is pretty close to the paradigm of MVC. But no matter there are in both places controller classes, they belong to different namespaces and different assemblies and different runtime environments, even though apparently they do the same thing. They merged the two things together. And they found out what? That there is no need to have web API anymore. Which is precisely what I've been saying for at least 5 years. Look at me. Today, if you have an ASP.NET MVC application, and you need to expose JSON endpoints, which is the primary reason to have a web API project, right? Can you tell me that you are missing something if you simply create a dedicated API controller class in your MVC and have it serve JSON data? It's the same. It's exactly the same. We can argue on the fact that the controller class of web API has some extra features, small features like content negotiation, which means automatic finding an automatic switch based on a header to return XML or JSON data. That's a stupid thing. We can achieve exactly the same with 3 lines of code because we're developers, right? In plain MVC today. And today, if we completely avoid web API, we can still serve JSON data, enable REST interfaces, without doubling the runtime environment costs. Okay, fine. We want to drop system web. Agreed. We bring MVC HTML generation to the new runtime, but at that point we have a single runtime environment and a new controller class that can serve JSON, HTML, and even do content negotiation. So there is no longer any need to distinguish controllers for web API and controllers for MVC. There is just one controller class that can return a JSON or HTML. Oh, I mean, that's it. So the size of the runtime environment is, this is an architectural demonstration, of course, smaller. Smaller because it's the new pipeline has been created now, so following architectural, more modern practices. It's newer code, specifically targeted for the features of today, one of which is controlling the granularity of the services we enable. Another feature is enabling dependency injection. Okay, there is native dependency injection, thanks God. So it's smaller because it's newer and targeted. It could be made even smaller because you can control exactly which services you enable, so you have a much better control over the memory footprint of your apps and the time it takes and the memory it takes to process every single request. This is a fact. But only if you choose full core. So the things that for sure changes for for you, if you go to core, is no longer tight coupling between ASP.NET and IIS, which was presented as a big win only a few years ago, but we all know that things in this business, in this industry, change. So, no surprise. No longer platform dependence. IIS and ASP.NET, is no longer limited to the Windows platform. This is not really a bad news, but whether it's a great news for your business, you decide. System web is now officially legacy code, and being that a code whose foundation was devised back in 1997, it can even make sense. The point is, the whole .NET Core, ASP.NET Core thing started with the idea of let's recreate the runtime to take system web apart. That was the small stone that started an avalanche that brought Microsoft over the entire past year to completely recreate the .NET framework. Keep in mind that a year ago, Microsoft, I think it was November, MVP Summit in November, they announced, well, in January, we release RC1 in end of November, RC2 in January, maximum February, we're done. February 2016, so over 6 months ago. And, I don't know here in Warsaw, but in Italy, where I live, RC means release candidate. Okay, RC1 means first example of a release candidate. So release candidate, this is good to release. So this is candidate to be released. Just, tell us if you can spot something so critical, so crucial, that forces us to make some changes. But possibly in between RC1 and RC2, and by the way, with RC1, they also gave the Go Live license. So put this in production. It's ridiculous. Okay, and in between RC1 and RC2, the feedback they got was so crucial to rewrite completely everything. Well, not from scratch, but sort of. But again, jokes apart, they caught the opportunity to totally rewrite and restructure significantly the software business, the development business for the entire company. So it's a huge change for Microsoft, primarily, with an impact on everyone, every company, every customer that has a dependency, a business dependency on Microsoft products. So there is an impact. And we have to decide case by case, what is this impact? So we don't have to, the worst thing we could do is just be victim of the hype. Oh, this is great, this is new, this is this, this is that. Look carefully, that's my best advice from the bottom of my heart. Now, let me show you in Visual Studio the experience or the frustration. You decide, again. You go through when you try to write a new application for the new platform. So what I have here, rigorously in a virtual machine, because I won't allow for a long time more the core runtime to heat the iron of my machine. Here what we have, Visual Studio 2015, file, new project. And then here you have, let me try to activate the magnifier. And here we have the usual three types or two types of applications: core, so web app for the .NET framework, full, core, and then ASP.NET Web. Okay, regular web, and then ASP.NET Core for full framework and for core. Okay, when you click to create an ASP.NET Core web application, then you are asked to choose whether you want an empty app, a web application, or a web API, which has, it's there at this point simply because now Web API, the sense it makes is if you really want to expose a service through a REST interface that stands on its own with no UI. It now makes sense to present Web API as a framework to build a REST service, not in the previous version, because now you can host that just putting the code on a web server. Now, before core, you still had to put Web API within typically an MVC application, doubling the run times. The only other scenario was if you wanted to host Web API in a console application, but it's very, very specific, or in a Windows service scenario, so not really common. And the most use that I've seen of Web API in the past 3 years is just to host Web API in an MVC application, simply doubling the memory footprint. But this is a message that I really found a very hard time to pass. So if I choose empty, here is what I get. Let me go back to a situation that okay, sorry, because it already destroyed the application, so let me recreate it, a real one. So we start. The nice thing is that if now I pick up this application and run it, this application has a slightly different structure. In the project, there is a startup CS file, and there is no longer any global ASX. This is the first big difference you notice. But startup plays essentially the same role it played. Global ASX plays global ASX in current applications, because you cannot deploy a website without the global ASX file. I mean the markup of global ASX, because that is an XML file being read, and from there the modules in IIS read the name of the HTTP application class to be fired up to start receiving and processing requests. So if you forget to place the global ASX in production, your site won't be up and running in a way, so it won't be able to receive requests. Same story here. It's no longer global ASX, but the startup logic is provided by a class called startup CS. Another thing we notice is program.c#. And this is the most interesting change of everything, because it means that now any web application is actually a console application. Because there is the web server that receives incoming requests on a port that you specify in program C#. Okay? By default, it's the regular port 80. So requests flow into the web server. The web server, whether it's Apache or IIS, is must be extended with an integration module that essentially connects requests to installed ASP.NET apps. But the ASP.NET app is a console application. So there is a communication between two different executables. So the ASP.NET app you write essentially gets the request, processes the input parameters, produces a response. The response is passed back as a string, as bytes, to the front end of the web server, and then served back to the browser. So it's two distinct executable, and the ASP.NET app as weird as it may sound, is actually a console application. Program, oh, where is, oh my God, relax. There we go. This is the core code. Okay? We have in program C#, web host builder, use Kestrel, use content root, blah, 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 blah. Use startup, that's the most important part. So use startup is, the startup class is the class defined in startup CS. So it's our own class that needs to have a fixed prototype that we'll see in a moment. We build the host environment and we run the host. Now it starts listening to incoming requests from the integration module that connects this app to the host web server. Now, having spent months of my life studying the source code of ASP.NET, especially web forms, I can tell you that similar code exists in system web as well. It's just that we don't see it. Or it never surfaces out of the depth of system web assembly to the level of our code. But something like this exists because the overall architecture, so two executable connecting, is not really different from what we have today, and more importantly, is not even different from what we had in ASP.NET 1.0 back in 2000. In 2000, because of a missing alignment between requirements of the ASP.NET team and IIS, the very first version of ASP.NET shipped with their own custom worker process. It was called ASP.NET_WP, which was analogous to this. And it was communicating with IIS through a named pipe mechanism. Then, when the integration between IIS and ASP.NET got closer, the worker process stopped being an ASP.NET thing and became W3WP, part of the still an executable, but run in the context of application pools under the control of IIS. So now, it's not really surprising, okay, that there should be the need of firing up a receiver application that maintains and hosts internally the ASP.NET runtime now, because it's a different... Still me? Yeah. No, it's not me. One, two, three, 5. Okay. It's a subliminal message. Don't move. Stand. Okay. Let me stand. It's kind of hard. The architecture is nearly the... okay, even when I talk... Oh my God. Now what? And similar code existed already. No problem. One more thing we want to take a look at now is startup CS. And probably I have to turn down the magnifier because it's too big. Okay, here we find a couple of methods. I told you that this class is expected to have a sort of fixed prototype, which consists of configure services and configure methods. Now, these two methods are completely empty, or sort of empty. Configure services is empty.
which means that there is no service automatically added in an empty project. So we have to fill that out in some way to start enabling ourselves to do interesting things with code. The configure is where we configure the services we added in the previous step. Anyway, there are some built-in services already available as part of the system that we can already configure in some way. One is the logger factory that we receive as, I have to scroll horizontally, that we receive as an argument passed by the system. So we can configure the logger factory to say, enable us to log messages to the console. Env is a high hosting environment, tells us in some way whether we are in development configuration or in production configuration. And that can be used to enable the system to display the notorious yellow page of death. The classic, yellowish page with the stack trace of what went wrong. So we can now, as an example of the new level of granularity enabled, we can control, okay, use the stack trace page only if we are in development. And I can have an else branch there that instead enables exception handling to point to a fixed URL. Now, is this completely new? No, because in web forms and in MVC, of course, I could do the same. But in web forms and MVC Classic, I was called to do those things in web config. So this is an example of the fact that some and most basic things are still there, still doable, but in a completely different way. So whatever type of config information you were expected to place in web config, because web config doesn't exist anymore, no matter the fact that you see web config in the project there, because it's there, but it's part of the IIS integration. So it's not open to contain app-specific information. So all of the things, authentication, globalization, app settings, connection strings, all of the things, error handling that you could place through sections in web config must be enabled in some other way, programmatically here, adding and configuring services. Okay, so use the developer exception page and the else branch that we'll add in a second is the way for you to configure error handling. Now, this is interesting. The final lines here are interesting because app is the application builder, and it has a method called run. So it runs the code we provide, and the code we provide writes to the response wrapper for the requesting environment. So this is exactly the same as if we take today in web forms. In page load, we do response.write and the string. That's the effect, right? But today, the response is simply an object, okay, that will cause the output to be sent out of the executable that our app is now, and then to be passed across named pipes, or I don't know exactly what, to the host web server environment, and then package it up for the real requesting browser. So the effect is that if I just run here, build and run on this app, I will get a message saying, hello world, and nothing more. There is nothing like controllers, nothing like this here. So let's see what we can do to expand this to the minimum level of functionality. Open project. There we go, simple one. I've just made a few changes in this new project to enable a few basic capabilities. The first thing that I have done is this. In configure services, at the very, very minimum, and I would say it is too bare minimum, okay, I have to add services.add_MVC. I mean, granularity is great, but this is probably too much granular. Anyway, if I don't add the call there to add MVC, no chance I can deal with controllers. And beyond that, in configure services, this is configure services. In configure, I have to configure MVC using use MVC method to, at the very minimum, pass it the list of routes it had to listen for. So now I have MVC, and I have passed MVC the bare minimum piece of information it needs, the list of routes. And the list of routes, that's exactly the same kind of thing. Well, the syntax is slightly different from the one that we have today, so they packaged up in template what is in today map route extension method in current MVC 3 properties. But I mean, it's just expressing the URL as a template and indicating which one is a parameter, what is the name. Another important thing I must do is enabling static files. Otherwise, no chance my app will be able to serve an image. So if I put in img source, whatever, or a script file or a CSS file, no chance, a static resource, no chance it will be served if I misuse static files. So this is the very, very minimum that I want to add. And of course, I also want to comment out app run, because I enabled MVC. Then this is the else branch that I might want to add to enable production style error handling. And this is the same as having the home error URL put into webconfig. By the way, when you write this code on an empty project, so as you start adding services or configuring services, new NuGet packages are added on the fly because Visual Studio detects that there's a missing package and asks you to add. That, in a way, this is the same experience you go through if you use tools like a ReSharper or Code Rush, that in Visual Studio you type the name of, I don't know what, a class, and if the class can be found in one of the assemblies in the system, in the GAC, or in the project, these tools pop up and say, would you like to add a reference to? The same experience is natively provided by Visual Studio against NuGet packages. And the NuGet the references to require the NuGet packages are added to the project JSON file, which is the central console that keeps track of all the entire project. And finally, the thing that most scared me is introducing in ASP.NET Core custom global settings. I mean, the title of the application as a constant. What I do is I have in webconfig an app settings entry with the title, the part that represents the title of the app that never changes. Okay, it's there. And usually I put it there because sometimes I extend with version numbers. Now, to read a piece of code from, the old webconfig and made it available to a controller, you have to, to build a house in .NET Core. Look, first and foremost, you have to add a constructor to the startup class. And you have to create a configuration builder. You probably might want to drop also this line. And you have to tell which file, in this case, my app settings JSON, will contain your configuration data. So it's no longer webconfig, but it's another file, typically, but not exclusively, a JSON file. So my app settings is part of your project, and in this sample application, this is my JSON file with a config. So there is a globals property with a globals object with a title property called my first try. Now, to retrieve my first try and use it programmatically, just adding JSON file to the configuration builder is not enough, because I have to build a configuration object and made it available as a public property on the class startup. Here we go. And then I have to link yet another service, system service, that knows how to deal with what they call options. So application settings. So add options. Add options is not enough, because now I have to instruct add options on how to essentially map the JSON source code to the class I want to use to represent my application, my content. So global config is a class I have to write, that in this, I don't even know what it is. It's probably in common, yeah. This class is as complex as this. So this class essentially can be the C-sharpization of the JSON or a section of the JSON I have elsewhere in the project. So what I have to do now is, okay, to indicate how to map JSON properties to properties in this class. And this is what I can do. With services configure of global config and essentially map to global config whatever you find in the globals section of the configuration object that is based on the content of my settings JSON file. Finished? Not yet. Because now I have, excuse me? I'm finished. Okay, I finished. It's the final thing. I mean, guys are so interested. I mean, go out. Final thing is in the controller. Where is it? I lost the controller. It's too big. Here we go. In the controller, I have to import via dependency injection, I option of the type I declared, and finally, I can use the global piece of information. In the old programming style, I just use a global static variable, and I'm done. Thank you very much for your time. Sorry.